Welcome back to The Thinking Mind, a podcast all about psychiatry, psychotherapy, psychology, self-development, and related topics. Today, we're going to try out a new format for the show. Myself and my co-host, Dr. Anya Borissova, will be discussing scientific research, by which I mean we're going to break down real scientific papers. And we wanted to do this format for a few different reasons. We wanted to, of course, discuss the insights that new research can give us as to the nature of mental health problems and how we can treat them. But we also wanted to discuss and teach our listeners a bit about the scientific method itself, like how science actually works and what makes good science versus bad science. And we really wanted to discuss how science is interpreted and reported in the media, and especially by people who want to sell stuff and products and to use science as an evidence base to sell certain products, because obviously we now know we're living in an ecosystem full of misinformation. And I think the more people understand a little bit about how science works, the limitations of science, but also what makes really good science, the better equipped people are to look at what's being reported and see for themselves and engage in a little bit of critical thinking. So today, we're going to be discussing two papers, both about depression. The first one, a study that examines whether or not Tony Robbins' 4-day immersive self-help program can treat depression. And the second one, looking at the difference between ketamine treatment and electroconvulsive therapy, otherwise known as electroshock therapy for depression, and whether or not patient preference had any impact on the treatment outcome itself. So very interesting stuff. As you'll hear in the interview itself, Anya is the best person on the team to discuss this stuff with because she's an academic trainee, which means she's very much immersed in the research world and looking at and thinking about research all the time. We hope that you, the listeners, will enjoy and get a lot out of this episode. If you'd like to support the podcast, do check out some of the services we offer in the description below. Thanks for listening. And now here's today's conversation with Dr. Anya Borissova. Today we're going to be discussing, can Tony Robbins cure depression? How does ketamine compare with electroconvulsive therapy for depressed patients? These are all topics we're going to discuss through the lens of science and scientific research. And with me to discuss these topics today is Dr. Anya Borissova. Anya, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Alex.
I hope you don't mind that I kind of think of you as our scientific correspondent, as I say on the podcast. You know, I'm a clinician, obviously, but I'm not a researcher. I've not really done research. You're an academic trainee, which means you're involved in doing research and thinking about research a lot. So we very much value your expertise in this regard. And today we're going to talk about two scientific papers. First paper we're going to discuss today.
So I thought we would start with the Tony Robbins paper. And I guess some things to say before we dive into it, just to give everyone a bit of a base of how we're going to be thinking about these different papers. What I guess you and I would like to try to do is not only talk about what these papers found and what the implications of it might be, but actually be a little bit critical of how well done was the study, how well done was the interpretation of the results, were there any problems with it, and what does the field need in the future to take the ideas forward.
And we will put the links to all of these papers in the description. But what is the Tony Robbins paper? What's the study they carried out?
So it was a study, and actually not done by Tony Robbins, a researcher called Ariel Gans, and the senior author was Michael Snyder. So the paper asked the question of whether a psychosocial training program, which is one of the ones run by Tony Robbins, what effects that would have on depression and well-being. And they recruited a selection of people who had symptoms of depression, and they put them through either this program, the psychosocial training program, or through a control condition, which was gratitude journaling. Mm-hmm. So big thing to explain here, what's a control condition? So it's a really, really key thing to look out for in any study that is saying that it's showing the effects of an intervention in terms of judging the quality of that study. So what a control condition does is it allows us to measure the general effects on a condition that occur just by virtue of the person being in a trial.
Right.
So when someone enters a clinical trial or a clinical study of some sort, they are instantly exposed to way more psychosocial support than they've had before. So by that, I mean just contact with people.
Contact with people.
Contact with people, and contact with people who are interested, and usually people who are really, really nice because they want people to stay in the study and to complete the study. So they also have, and the contact with interested people is another really important point. So for some people, especially when you're talking about the US, where this study was conducted and where the healthcare system is, often kind of very much paid for, and it can be very difficult to access healthcare, and especially mental health care. When people enter these kinds of studies, it will sometimes be one of the first times where they've been able to talk about their symptoms and talk about how they feel to an interested person. And as you and I both know, Alex, in the field that we work in, good quality listening, so interested, caring listening, is a therapeutic intervention. It's right.
Mm-hmm. So in this paper, they're comparing a group of people, my understanding is some with depression, some without, who underwent Tony Robbins' self-help program, which I think is a 4-day immersive program, and then with some exercises to do after, and to make sure that they're, getting the actual beneficial effect of that, they're comparing it to the control group, as you mentioned, which is also a mixture of depressed and non-depressed individuals. And instead of giving them they're not giving them no intervention, they're giving them a small intervention. In this case, you said gratitude journaling. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's an interesting study off the bat, because there's this interesting split between the self-help world, which is generally in the private industry world, and can make lots of people lots of money, sometimes in more or less ethical ways, and the more formal mental health world. So, I mean, I was really curious to see this study, because you think of someone like Tony Robbins, who has so much success, and who seems to, on the face of it, have affected so many people in a positive way. Really interesting, compelling for me to see, okay, so maybe his method's been studied scientifically. I wonder what it shows. And if you hear him talking about it, he talks about it as a kind of resounding success. He says basically incredible treatment for depression. His intervention is an incredible treatment for depression, as shown by this study. Can you tell us more about what happened in the study, and is this the unilateral success that he claims that it is?
Yeah, really interesting, because I saw that on the website as well. When you look at the intervention that they used, they make a big deal out of the findings of this study. Sort of 100% of people with depression got better, which sounds obviously fantastic.
Was that the result?
Well, interesting. So a few things to pull out. So the number of people that were participating was about 20. So I think they had sort of 23 and 22 participants in each group. Now, of those, about 13, 14 in each group met thresholds for depression. Now, so when we start to think about studies, we start to think about the population that was studied, and is it representative of, and if we're thinking about applying that study more broadly, is it representative of the kind of patient cohorts that we might see? So 13, 14 people with depression out of a group of about 20. The way that they measured depression was using a scale called the PHQ-9, which is a very well validated, very widely used scale, generally as a screening measure rather than as a diagnostic tool. And I would say this is probably the first point of improvement were the study to be done again, is that the diagnosis wasn't confirmed by any kind of professional. So it was purely based on this scale.
And so the scale is what the patients report about themselves, which is known to be unreliable.
It's not necessarily known to be unreliable, actually. So it's increasingly recognized in I think, depression, mental health research, that actually what the patients say about their symptoms is often reasonably well correlated to what clinicians think about their symptoms, but also that it maybe is more important than what clinicians think about their symptoms. So I think it's not necessarily that it's unreliable, but is that it's probably not the standard that is applied across the field. So generally in depression research, you would have both. So you would have both a self-report and
a clinician sitting opposite them saying, yes, I think I would confirm this diagnosis. You are depressed at the moment.
Exactly. Because there's a lot of reasons for why someone might fill in a scale to say that they've been feeling sad, to say that they've not been sleeping that well, to say that they've been feeling a bit more tense in the last 2 weeks. The second point to pull out about the population itself is that the numbers are pretty small. So this is probably a pilot study, sort of feasibility study level. So having 20 people is not huge. Having 14 people is obviously even less. If we're looking to really get a good idea of whether a new treatment works, we're sort of wanting to have the rules that I think the American licensing organization has for medications is two big trials, and by big, it's over hundreds of people being involved. So this is a small study, which doesn't mean it's not an important study, but it's a small study. So, and it that kind of affects what we do with the interpretation of it.
So it's the right kind of study, right? Because am I right in saying it's a randomized controlled trial?
It is, yeah. And so that's important. So people were assigned to the conditions randomly, and they had the controlled bit is what we were talking about before, so that there was a control condition, so that there was a group of people that were made to do something that wasn't like the intervention, but that aims to control, that is to...
is it like simulating an intervention?
So, to account for basically some of the non-specific bits of that will also lead to someone feeling better.
Like would that account for the placebo effect?
Exactly. Okay. Yeah, exactly. So placebo effect isn't just medications; it's any intervention will have a placebo effect as well.
And am I right in saying this randomized controlled trial was single blind? And what does that mean? What is blinding in a trial?
So blinding refers to whether people know what intervention they're getting or not. Now, it's particularly difficult to achieve in trials that try to measure a psychotherapy or, psychological type intervention. It is also difficult to do in some of the kind of latest medication trials that we're seeing with psychedelics. The reason why it's difficult to do is because basically people kind of know what they're getting. So people in this situation will know if they went to the Tony Robbins course or not.
Exactly.
There's no way for them to not know. And the problem with that is that you then get into the problems of expectancy effects. So now I don't know how this trial was advertised. I don't know whether it was, do you want to go to the Tony Robbins, fantastic self-help course? Or, if it was advertised a bit more blandly as just, are you feeling a bit sad? Do you want to try a new treatment?
So even the marketing.
Oh, for sure.
Would create an effect.
Yeah, because all of that stuff leads to like an expectation. So the person going in, if they are expecting to get better with the treatment, they will do better. So, and that's part of the placebo effect. That's again a huge problem in the psychedelic field. And another related problem is the nocebo effect. So people who don't get put into the group that get the fancy, dazzling new intervention are then disappointed. They know that they're getting the dud. In this study, I think one of the helpful things that they did is that everyone was told that they would then get a ticket to go to the self-help intervention later. And that's, I think, kind of a bit of a double-edged sword. It's good because I think it probably removes some of the disappointment that the non-active treatment group might have felt. But it also obviously kind of amps up how good the self-help program is.
But doesn't it also re-emphasize to that group that they're not really getting any meaningful treatment? And isn't that something you want to avoid in the control arm?
It's tricky. So I guess another key principle of doing research is that you want to have what's called equipoise. So you want to, as the person setting up the study, genuinely not know whether the thing that you're testing is better or worse than the alternative. And that's kind of a principle of ethics. It's obviously really important when it comes to drugs, medications, things that have potentially serious side effects. But as we know, psychotherapy and self-help can have side effects as well, and it can have adverse effects.
Yeah, and in the case of the Tony Robbins course, I think it costs thousands of dollars per person.
Right, yeah.
Which is, to be noted.
For sure. And obviously everyone here got it for people here got it for free, and actually the course was donated to the research study as well. So the researchers, they didn't have to get a multi-million pound grant to be able to run the study.
So this trial was single blind, which means, does that mean only the researchers were blind to where the participants were allocated? Yeah,
exactly. So and this is a very good point of what they did, is that the people who sort of received the results and analysed the results just got them labelled as group A and B. So they didn't know what group A and B related to. So as they were looking at the different depression scores, different anxiety scores, they didn't know which group had received which treatment, which is helpful and which is important. I think one really important thing that I want to pull in about the interventions is that, so the self-help program it's a 6-day immersive program. So so they go, I don't know how many hours it is, but I assume it's sort of a whole day, and someone's getting really excited on a stage, and you're coming up on the stage and hugging the person, and you're, they were sort of doing, being taught things like meditation, goal setting, the importance of exercise, reframing ideas, kind of working on their goals, new beliefs. Quite an intensive thing. Lots of those interventions we know from the psychological literature are very helpful things to patients. The control group, they did 10 minutes of gratitude journaling a day. Now, that controls for some of what people did then after they'd gone to the course. So after they'd gone to the course, they then spent 10 minutes a day sort of doing exercises related to the course. But it doesn't control for going to a week's session where you're sort of around with people, where you're spending a lot of time reflecting, spending a lot of time moving your body.
So what do you think might have been a better control?
So the problem of how you control for psychological therapies is a huge one. So this is way better than having a waitlist control, which is what a lot of trials have. But I think it's difficult because I think the self-help program has so many components to it. You maybe take the hit and accept that you're going to have some kind of training program with people that involves some of those components. So you send people just to like a meditation retreat for a week. Or you do something where people have to go somewhere for a week but not do any of those things. So be with people, but maybe and do activities without a psychological intention. So then you may be taking the hit on the social aspect and the exercise bit. But if you're saying that it's about really what's happening at the intervention, so if you're saying it's the cognitive reframing, it's the meditation, it's the goal visualization, the goal setting, that's the guided hypnosis that's important, then it's maybe less about being in a room full of people. So so if you maybe send everyone to a conference or something for a week on a topic not related to mental health, on a topic related to like chocolate, gardening, exactly. Yeah. Send them into a gardening course. No, don't send them to a gardening course. Are really good. So those are some of the problems, I guess, with the setup of the study, but also some of the good things, because at least they did try to have a control arm. But again, it's worth noting that a lot of those people didn't have depression, and a lot of those people...
Well, it's not a lot of people in the first place.
And a lot of them perhaps, and I think it's fair to assume that a proportion of them wouldn't be diagnosed with depression if they had been seen by a clinician.
Right.
And they are certainly not going to be the same kinds of people that we see with depression in hospitals or in psychiatric services. So this is not the same population.
It's on the milder end of the spectrum.
It's going to be on the milder end. It is potentially some of these people wouldn't even get to their GP if we're thinking about a UK population in terms of the severity.
So then what did the results show?
I know. Let's get to the actual... Enough of the faff. But so what the results showed, it was brilliant. And actually on the first, one thing that's worth noting is that authors did something that was really good, is they found some errors in their analysis and they released a correction to the paper. So on the first iteration, they did show that 100% of people with depression got better with the intervention. So that's 14 out of 14 by the end of the 6 weeks. And the 6 week being sort of the total duration of the study. And that compares to, and I'm referring to my notes, that compares to 4 out of 13 people in the gratitude journaling group, which is, I've written 41%. Yeah, I guess that's probably about right. So just under half of people in the gratitude journaling group got better, which is a reasonable placebo rate. Sort of that's a similar placebo response rate to what we see in medication and psychotherapy trials. So
pretty good advert for gratitude journaling.
Pretty good advert for gratitude, absolutely. And so the actual sort of remission rate was 93%. So they do need to update their website on the basis of the correction that was released to the paper.
So the remittance rate in the group receiving the self-help treatment was 93%?
Was 93% of the people with depression, so the 14 people.
And after how long? How long did they follow up people for?
So this was really interesting. So people kind of did most of their improvement after the first week. And to be honest, I don't know entirely what to make of it. So people got the most benefit just from going to the self-help course in the first week. So I think they, both in the gratitude journaling group and in the going to the self-help course group, they dropped their scores on depression, or something like 50, 60% of people were getting better already. And then they continued to improve after that first week in the self-help intervention group. So they continued to get better until the point where, as we say, 93% were feeling better by the end of 6 weeks, which is the total time that they did the study for. And that's a good duration. I mean, we know that depression is a chronic condition. So actually we love to see trials that go on for 6 months, a year. That's the ideal. A lot of people don't do that. So a lot of the antidepressant trials go on for 8 to 12 weeks. A lot of them make a big deal out of what happens in the first couple of weeks. So it's a general criticism of the field. And I think it's not fair as a criticism to level, I think, at this study. But as with the rest of the field, let's see how these people were doing a year down the line. Let's see how these people were doing 6 months down the line. I think that's the bit that, as clinicians, that's what we want to know. And probably not just as clinicians. I think people with depression, that's what they want to know.
So normally at the end of the paper, the authors will have a discussion of sorts and draw some conclusions. What conclusions did they draw, and do you agree with them?
I think some of what their discussion was about was comparing the effects of this intervention to other, to kind of response recovery rates in other interventions. And I think that's actually a reasonable comparison to make. So kind of going back to your first point, how well does this psychosocial training program do in comparison to antidepressant medications? So they can't answer that question with the trial that they've done because they haven't compared.
They'd have to do a direct comparison. So one group antidepressants, one group, I guess, control, one group psychosocial training.
Exactly. That'd be the ideal way of doing it. Because then you know that everyone's kind of gone through the same kind of procedures. I think it's not as good, but I think it's reasonable to look at, response and remission rates that you get in other trials as a bit of an indicator. Again, this is something that a lot of people will do in their papers. So whilst it's not kind of the best quality of evidence, it's probably reasonable. And they compare it to a very specific study which tested psilocybin and psychological therapy in people with depression. Probably not a completely fair comparison given the diagnostic differences. So in the trial the trial that they compared to, they were people with clinician diagnosed major depressive disorder, as in.
And did you say treatment resistant?
Not treatment resistant.
Not treatment resistant, but
yeah.
Clinician diagnosed major depression as opposed to the more milder depression of the people likely to be included in the study.
Exactly. And we know that, they only had one person with severe depression in in this study. So we know that the people that they're kind of comparing to would have had more severe depression. But they, nonetheless, kind of if you look at the big picture in the literature, so if you look at what's called meta-analyses, so studies that pull in loads and loads of studies together and give you an idea of averages across, 50, 100 studies, you get you get a response remission of like 33 to 41% in psychological therapy trials. You get 50% remission in medication trials. So it does compare well, with the provision that it's a small study. And I know we had David Taylor on the podcast last week, and he talks about how early on trials tend to show much bigger effects than as an intervention gets more widely used. And the more that you repeat and try to replicate a study, the more that size of effect tends to come down. And I think so it's not quite a fair comparison for me to be saying this one study with 20 people had a 30% greater remission rate than these hundreds of studies with thousands of patients, because there's just the chance that what you're getting is random error and kind of random variation.
And I suppose one thing we haven't talked about yet, which would be great to get your take on, is the idea of bias and, participants like self-selecting for studies. So just on the face of it, a study like this, including someone like Tony Robbins, who's very famous and well-known and, again, has amazing marketing, better marketing than any pharmaceutical company could ever hope for, you can imagine it would attract a certain kind of person who might already know who he is, who might be interested in self-help, self-development type strategies, who might be like dispositionally at a personality level more ready to accept some of the ideas in his training, like reframing ideas and goal setting, etc. And I say that as someone who I kind of resonate with that way of thinking, but I can imagine not everyone does. And so it might be quite different from a medication where like your disposition in that personality sense might make that difference. So would you worry that a study like this could select for a very particular kind of person?
I think definitely, I think it could. And I think it's a point that the authors make. And they draw parallels with the psychedelic literature where, again, there's very much a risk that the people who are volunteering for the psychedelic trials are people who, especially the early ones, are people who were really invested in that psychedelic treatment working for them. So again, I think it's a problem that can probably be leveled at more of the field, and it's what I'd love to know, and I may have missed it in the supplementary information, but I'd love to know what the advertisement for this study was. So whether people knew when signing up that it was going to be, so whether they were trying to attract Tony Robbins fans, or whether they were just trying to attract people who might be interested in a self-help program, which would kind of give you, I think, slightly different levels of bias and slightly different, or whether whether they were just people wanting to try a new kind of treatment for depression. But I imagine they would have been giving them a bit more information than that. But it leads, it will lead well to the next paper that we'll talk about in terms of patient preference and sort of the what that means for outcomes. So yeah, it's an important thing to manage, and I think the management of it probably comes at the recruitment stage. So ideally, in a study like this, would you just want it advertised as plainly as possible? Oh my God, yeah,
boring. We're looking for boring. We're looking for people, but I guess you want it as undifferentiated as possible.
Yeah. And that's really hard because recruitment for research is really hard. So you've got to stand out. You're going to want to use anything at your disposal, because I think they had a really short recruitment period. They recruited over like 2 weeks or something, which is wild. Like I've never, unless I missed a year in between that. But I think it was just really quick. They sort of had the course coming up in December, and they recruited in the couple weeks before the course. and they just got people straight onto it.
And to you, does that suggest that it was like the normal Tony Robbins marketing involved, that they could recruit people so quickly?
I mean, maybe. Or they sort of already had a pool of volunteers that they regularly use, and they were able to kind of recruit, they had sort of a well-oiled machine, and they had lots of research assistants working to screen people and recruit people. But yeah, so it's, unfortunately, I think the best science is kind of the most boring science. A lot
Science
of the time.
is boring.
Science, yeah, it should be boring.
Are there any other limitations or strengths of the study that you wanted to point out?
I think another important strength is the range of outcomes that they looked at. So they make a big deal out of the improvement in social functioning that people had as a result of the self-help intervention.
Is that also measured by the PHQ-9?
No, so they used a different scale. So it's sort of, again, a questionnaire scale that people filled in, but that will ask them things like how much their symptoms affected their ability to go to work, engage in their relationships, partake in home tasks. And it's addressing, again, a problem that we see in the field or not that we see in the field, but a problem that's being recognised in the field, that what are the outcomes that actually matter to people? And arguably, it's not necessarily a 2-point difference in their sleep or anxiety score, but it's whether they were able to go out for dinner with their partner, whether they were able to do their weekly shopping, whether they were able to manage their bills, do their cleaning. So measuring how well people are functioning and showing that they improved in that, I think is rightly so that they're making a big deal out of that.
Is that not so common you find in other studies?
I think it's happening more, but it's certainly reported and less of a fanfare is made about it, and it's certainly not the thing that will enter the textbooks when deciding which treatments to kind of rate as being, when saying which treatment is better than which treatment, that will be based on changes in the symptom scores. Maybe in 5 to 10 years that will be different, but at the moment that's kind of where our knowledge base is.
Any other limitations of the study, you think?
Oh no, sorry, I did have one, and this is again a really good general one for people to look out for if they're ever reading blogs or interpretations or reading the study itself. Who's funding the study?
Oh, okay. Yeah, of course.
So in this case, the study itself, I think, was funded sort of by research grants that people had, or I think one person had a pre-doctoral fellowship, which will be sort of a pot of money given to someone to complete work towards what will then be a PhD dissertation. But in the correction that they released, where they dropped the remission rate from 100% to 93%, they also noted that the senior author, I think, had opened some kind of business that the corporation related to Tony Robbins had invested in, and that this had happened after after the publication of results and after the completion of the study, and they don't think that it had an impact on any of the results that were discussed. But for openness, they're reporting it, which is great practice, good for them for doing that. But I guess it does raise eyebrows, because
it makes you wonder if they have a pre-existing personal relationship.
Yes, exactly. And did that in any way affect the way that the study was, again, subtle things that might introduce bias, the way that the study was sold to people, the way that the study was, because numbers can't lie. So participants report the scores that they report, and those scores are compared with an analysis, and unless you're doing really atrocious science, you're not going to be fudging the numbers. But I guess the bits that you can introduce bias is just, again, how the study is explained to people, how people are taken through the study, how much hype there is in the research team about one part of the main intervention rather than the control intervention. I'm trying to think other ways, but,
So who's funding the study and these kinds of conflicts of interest? As we've talked about quite a lot on the podcast, when pharma companies are involved is really important, because obviously that could influence subtle ways in how studies are designed to emphasize or underemphasize the effectiveness of an intervention, I guess.
For sure. And one way of getting around that is, and I guess this is the other thing that we don't know is, and I think David Taylor talked about this, is pre-registering studies. So before the study's done, having listing out all of the things that you're going to be asking people, all of the measures that you're going to be collecting, all the questionnaires that you're going to be doing, and exactly what comparisons you're going to be running, which groups you're going to be comparing, if you're going to be splitting groups in some way. And you can then do extra analyses after the study's done, but you have to label them as exploratory analyses, so people take them with a bit more of a pinch of salt. So here, I guess what we don't know, because it wasn't pre-registered, we don't know if there's some extra questionnaires that showed something awful happening. Unlikely, very unlikely. But as a general point, that's the thing to look out for if you're reading other studies where you're trying to assess their quality.
Okay, cool. So we've talked about the nuts and bolts of this study. So the takeaway sounds something like it suggests that a psychosocial intervention similar to the Tony Robbins program or the Tony Robbins program can be having some benefit, but we need to study it with wider groups of people. Ideally, if you're really interested in how effective it is for depression, probably more severe levels of depression confirmed by a clinician. Would those be the main takeaways for you?
Yeah, and I think it is definitely too much to say that this is a program that shows 100% benefit to people with depression.
Or even, would you say it shows 93% benefit?
Or even 90, yeah, for sure. That I think, I don't think we can say that this is representative of the average person with depression. I think it is representative of a particular kind of person with depression. And I think that's fair to have as a message, but I don't think it is fair to say, whoever you are, whatever kind of depression you have, come and do this. It's going to be great.
So more data required.
More data required for sure, and more data in wider groups.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to ask you one more question on this study before we move on, which is, as it stands now, flaws and all, does this study stimulate your thinking in any way? Does it change your mind about anything? Did it make you have any novel thoughts? Would it change your practice? Anything along those lines?
I think it probably wouldn't change my practice, but that's because I'm already really bought into the idea that actually anything that helps people to reflect on their life, to get more active, to do things that are in line with their values that they've reflected on, anything that gets kind of people to take a step back, be that in a mindful way, in a meditation way, in a goal-setting way, hypnosis way, whatever, I think can have really big impacts on people's well-being. And I think in the kinds of depression, anxiety that we see in psychiatry, I think is an important part of the treatment package. So I guess it confirms for me that can certainly be the case. And I mean, I guess, as you say, gratitude journaling, not bad at all.
Bit of gratitude. I'll tell you one thought I had about this study, again, more my thinking being stimulated, is really, for me, the word immersive stands out. We don't really have any immersive treatments with a unilaterally positive bent. In psychiatry, things get immersive when you're very unwell, typically, and you might get admitted to a hospital. And yes, that's immersive. In some ways that are helpful, in some ways that are really not helpful. So this paper, although I think I fully agree with you, more data required, it made me think maybe there's something in the immersive aspect, and having a program, again, with a wholly positive bent, helping people when they're having difficulties with their mental health. It might, cost more and require more investment at the front end. But if it's effective and you can, give people a package of care that's very intensive for a few days, a week, a couple of weeks, and then transition slowly to a less intense, more outpatient kind of treatment, that might be something worth thinking about. Because immersion has a lot of advantages. It gives you a community. it takes you out of your setting where a lot of your more unhelpful patterns have a chance to set in. It can kind of give you that sense of like how different your life can be for a little bit of time, even if it's a few days. In a way, a visit to a therapist's office, say, or a doctor's office can't really do that. So one takeaway for me is like, maybe we should be thinking about more like positively immersive treatments.
I think that really makes sense. And I guess it kind of exists, but not at the front end. You know, so where you and I have both worked in South London, there's the recovery colleges, which actually tends to be a feature of, I think, lots of mental health trusts in the UK have something like this. And it's something that's run by the Mental Health Trust, but it's a place where people who who have received treatment and their family members can go and attend courses that are, you know, either related to the condition and, you know, understanding anxiety, understanding depression, understanding psychosis, or the principles of well-being, or they have apparently a super popular improvisation, you know, 8-week course that people can attend there, or like radio program making or podcasting, you know, so we have something that's a little bit like this. It's often added as a bit of an afterthought to treatment plans, I think. It can be very hard to get people bought into the idea of going to it. It tends to be thought about as well towards the point at which a person's reaching the end of their treatment.
Yes.
But I guess, as you say, what this makes us think is actually, can we get people going to it the moment they come through the door? And can we get something that exists not in what we are in secondary care, you know, in hospitals, the bit that people have to be referred to, the specialist bit, but can it exist more at a community level? And it exists for other disorders. You know, it exists for when someone gets first diagnosed with diabetes, they go on a residential type program, or they can go onto a program where they learn everything about diabetes and how to manage it. And I guess it's less necessarily well-being focused, rather, you know, it's focused on the disease.
And what that makes me think about is also the value of having like a charismatic front man that's shepherding people to your treatment. And this has been discussed before, because you think of like really famous psychotherapy clinicians across the years. So like your Freuds, Jung, Carl Rogers. It was often said anecdotally that people like that had a special effect all of their own because they were so charismatic and they were leaders in their field. And I imagine getting treatment from someone like that, or someone like a Tony Robbins, who's incredibly charismatic, will have a placebo effect, if you like, all of its own, but obviously just attract more people. You know, your marketing is better. And so by getting more people through the door, you're obviously going to be able to help more people in a way that a recovery college, which might teach all the right stuff, might struggle with just to get people through the door. So there might be that sort of charisma factor as well, which unfortunately is hard to replicate when you're thinking about how do you treat people in the hundreds and thousands. So that issue occurred to me as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've picked this study apart to death. Can Tony Robbins cure depression? Answer is more data required.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tony.
Yeah.
Could you introduce the next study you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, sure. I'll bring in the one that I guess follows on a little bit from some of the issues that we talked about, which is a study that compared the outcomes from people being given ketamine or electroconvulsive therapy for their depression. Now, the study that I'm actually going to talk about is a secondary analysis of that study. So I'm not going to talk about the results of the study other than sort of in a brief 1-2 lines, because I'm sure people will be really mad if I don't actually tell them the answer to is ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, or ketamine better for depression. But the thing that this secondary analysis did was look at what patients preferred to get in terms of treatment, whether that had an impact on outcomes and on adverse events, which is a really, really interesting question, and links in with the things we've been talking about in terms of the placebo effect, in terms of what the effects of expectation is, and builds on a literature that exists already in both mental health treatments, but actually treatments generally, so for physical illness as well, that what patients prefer in terms of treatments. It matters, yeah. And I guess it's part of the basis for patient-centered care, so the idea that clinicians need to really involve patients in making decisions about their care. And I think this paper, and I guess a bit of a spoiler, but this paper really underlines the importance of that again. But it underlines it in an interesting way, and in a way that I think I don't completely know what to make of. So it'll be interesting to discuss our ideas about it.
So what did the first study show? So the first study was attempting to compare how effective ketamine was versus electroconvulsive therapy. Is that right?
Exactly. And so I guess in terms of a bit of background, electroconvulsive therapies are most effective and fastest treatment for depression that has been difficult to treat in psychiatry. It's one of the safest treatments that we have. So it's kind of got potentially very few side effects, although some potentially quite important and serious side effects. But it's our go-to for depression that hasn't got better with other things. So it's a really important part of our treatment. Ketamine is a new-ish medication treatment. I say new-ish because actually it's in the US, certainly for any listeners there. It's been around. So it's been around as a non-psychiatric treatment forever. So it's not forever. Obviously not forever. But it's it's used as an anesthetic. It's used as a painkiller. It's on the WHO list of sort of must-have medications because it's such a good anesthetic medication, as in something that can put people to sleep.
And I think there was also a famous researcher named John Lilly who was researching ketamine extensively, I believe in the 60s and 70s. And used it in like sensory deprivation tanks and also gave it to dolphins.
Oh my gosh, I have not heard of that.
We don't have time to go into this, but
okay.
John Lilly researched extensively with ketamine and gave it to dolphins.
Dolphins, oh my gosh, okay.
With mixed results.
I thought you were going to bring up the horse tranquilizer bit when you started to talk about, no, but I'm glad we can leave that. But yeah, so ketamine's, as most treatments come about, was a bit serendipitous. I think it was being used as something that can lead to symptoms that in some ways mimic psychosis. So it kind of, the keys, and this speaks to the key side effects, but people feel kind of detached from reality. People can feel like their thinking gets quite muddled, so they sort of struggle to make sense of their own ideas, and they get a bit disorganized in how they speak and how they act. So it was being tested there, found to unexpectedly have an impact on mood, and then tested for people with problems with their mood. And, from there we've had loads and loads of research. It's now licensed as a nasal spray, which is available really across the world, although not in the UK, because it's not felt that the evidence is strong enough to merit its costs. So we can't really prescribe it in the UK because it's not costed by the people that pay for treatments.
Not prescribed as a nasal spray?
Sorry, as a nasal spray, yes.
Because they do have ketamine clinics in the UK, don't they?
They do. So yeah, so there's a few NHS ketamine clinics now. There's more private ones. In the US, you can get mail order ketamine, which is kind of terrifying.
I mean, I'm interested in your view because you're familiar with the literature on ketamine. Like, what would your stance be on using ketamine in a public health system? Would it be quite similar to the NHS, where there are set up sort of prescribed clinics with a relatively high barrier to entry? Based on your knowledge of ketamine, do you agree with other countries who are more liberal with it?
I think I don't agree with just how liberal it's got, because it's like all of our treatments, it's not without its drawbacks. And so I think some of the really prominent clinicians who use ketamine in the UK call for things like registers of how it's being used so that it can be kept track of, so that people can't do things like shop around clinics, so that people can't.
Because ketamine, people can and do, and I've met them in addiction clinics, become addicted to ketamine and have serious physical health consequences.
Exactly. And people who use ketamine as a recreational drug tend to use much higher doses than what is used in when ketamine is used as a depression treatment. But nonetheless, you see that tolerance can develop as people get more and more doses, even in a clinical setting. And that's, so the idea that you kind of need more of the drug to get to the same effects. So, and we've seen plenty of high profile cases that to show that actually it's very possible to develop an addiction to ketamine, especially if it's not being prescribed in a judicious, careful way. So if there's no, if you can be turned down at one clinic and go to another clinic and there's no record and there's kind of no follow-up.
Anything could happen.
Anything could happen. And actually and if you can be therefore getting, instead of twice or 3 times a week prescriptions of ketamine, you manage to get it 7 days a week, you're clearly entering the realms of how people are using it recreationally, where we know that certainly a lot of problems occur.
So how does ketamine compare with electroconvulsive therapy in that first study?
Yeah, let's get back to the point. Good. Thank you, Alex. So what that study basically showed is that ketamine is non-inferior to electroconvulsive therapy, which is a wordy way of saying it doesn't look like it's better, it doesn't look like it's worse. And that sounds like a boring outcome, but actually it's a really useful outcome because they are drugs that have different side effects. They have different reasons for why you would exclude someone from receiving it as a treatment. And as I said before, ECT is right now, kind of our end of the line. This treatment, if nothing else has worked, this has a chance of working. So to have another drug that we can maybe add into that segment is really useful. And because some people some people might prefer to have ketamine.
Which we'll get on to.
Yes.
But just before we do that, we don't have time to go into the nuts and bolts of the first study, but based on your reading of it, do you think that's a reliable result that we can bank on, that ketamine is non-inferior? It's okay if you don't necessarily know, but...
Yeah, do you know what? I haven't read it in the detail that I've read the second study, so I will be fully honest and say I'm not sure. What I will say is that it was conducted in a reasonable way. They had they had sort of, I think 400, 500 people participating. So it's a big study. And so those are really good signs.
Okay. So on the surface,
on
possibly...
the surface, it looks reasonable. It's still maybe not quite enough to change practice, but yeah, I think worth paying attention to.
And we'll put the link to that study as well so people can check it out and they could see if there are any criticisms made online. So could you walk us through the second study? So they're looking at what exactly, how patient preference plays into all of this and this choice between ketamine and electroconvulsive therapy? Yeah,
so it was pretty simple how they did it. So they basically just, I think an interesting part is that they realized part way through running the study that this is something that they should do, which means that the numbers in this study are smaller. There's about 260 people who were asked the patient preference question. Interestingly, they chose to ask people at the very end of the study. So once people had already received all of the treatments. And they said they did this so that asking the question didn't in any way bias patients' course through the study or lead to increases in dropout, for example, by which I guess they mean on the off chance that someone hadn't yet thought about which treatment they preferred, and then they got asked the question, and then they self-reflected, and they realized what they really wanted was the electroconvulsive therapy, and they ended up in the ketamine group, they would just drop out.
Right.
I guess that's the thing that they were worried about.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a reasonable concern, but it's a big limitation in terms of the interpretation that we can put.
Yeah, and I mean, what were they asking? Which treatment did you prefer at the beginning, or which treatment do you prefer now, having had it?
So they were asking the first one. So they were asking people to think back to the best of your ability before you received any treatment. Which treatment did you want to get? And they had sort of a 7-point scale. So so what they could measure with that is kind of a moderate preference for ketamine, a strong preference for ketamine, a moderate preference for ECT, a strong preference for ECT, or just a neutral position, don't really mind.
Okay.
But the way that you frame that question is really interesting, because unfortunately the danger of asking it that way, because you're asking it after the people have had the treatments, is that their answering of the question, there's every chance it's being coloured by their experience of having received the treatment. And I guess it's a different view on the problem of asking it before, in just that what ends up happening may well, or just thinking about it may well affect what the outcome is. So, it's not perfect, but it's still worth seeing what happened after that, which I'll go on to. So I guess I'll just pull out the two sort of most, to my mind, kind of stark findings, and then we can discuss a bit about what it means. But so people who were preference matched, as in so people who said that they would prefer ketamine and got ketamine, did better with ketamine or did worse with ECT. But that wasn't the case with people who said they had a preference for ECT and sort of went either way. So for some reason, something about preferring ketamine and getting ketamine means you do better.
Right.
But if you prefer ECT and get ECT, that doesn't make a difference to how well you do with the treatment, which is surprising. You'd kind of expect that if there was, you'd perhaps expect that if there was a preference effect, it would matter either way. Yeah,
like I would have expected maybe more people having a preference for ketamine over ECT, just because ECT is like quite stigmatized and has a bad reputation. Ketamine is newer, more in vogue, has a better reputation. But assuming you did have a preference for ECT, I'm surprised that didn't carry over in the same way as ketamine.
Yeah, exactly. They didn't go into much as to why they thought that might be happening. And so perhaps you and I can try to come up with our own ideas for why it could be happening. And then the other thing that was interesting is that what it did affect, however, was side effects. So if you didn't prefer, let me get this the right way around. So if you didn't prefer ECT, but you got it, you were more likely to report side effects or experience side effects than if you preferred and got ECT. It didn't seem to matter with ketamine. So kind of the rate of side effects didn't seem to matter with whether you preferred or didn't prefer.
That's interesting as well.
It is. And it's almost sort of two sides of the same coin, in the sense that, if you have a preference for ketamine, you do better with ketamine and you sort of do overall worse with ECT, because you get more adverse effects because you're getting something that you didn't want. So, maybe you're just more likely to pay attention to the side effects. You're a bit miffed. Sure. But again, I think it's really curious as to why the preference for ketamine makes such an impact on the outcomes with ketamine. And it links with some of the research that's been done, which, so there was an interesting study that showed that you potentially lose quite a lot of the effects of ketamine if you deliver it under anesthetic. There were many limitations with that study. So that's not to say that ketamine only works if you know that you're getting ketamine. But it was an interesting signal that, is there something about kind of the expectation that people have with getting this treatment? Is there something about their appraisal of the experience in receiving this treatment? Because ECT is delivered under anesthetic, so people are asleep, unconscious. All they know is that they go into the room, then they're asleep, and they wake up in the recovery area.
It's a bit more like Severance.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah, completely. Except there's no bit. Well, as far as we know, there is no bit of you that is aware during the anesthetic. But I guess we'd never know, unless there's a whole world of anesthetic innies. I
guess it does make me think about ketamine as a dissociative, And so does ketamine help people have a more slightly dissociative frame of mind in and around the time they're getting treatment, such that, for example, side effects matter less?
Yes. And does it matter what you make of that dissociative experience? So, do you experience that dissociation as in some way more good as a you hear about this in antidepressant trials, when people get the nausea with medications like sertraline, which are really commonly used, sometimes people think like, okay, this is, that I feel a bit sick, but it's good. It means that it means it's working. Exactly.
That's like with Listerine mouthwash, making you feel that tingling in your mouth, even though we know that doesn't mean your mouth is cleaner.
Yeah. But God, yeah, without the tingling, you'd be like, what's going on?
Were there any other important results from the study?
I think those were the key ones that I guess that I wanted to focus on. So I think it's a useful part of the picture, and it aligns with what we know about the importance of patient preference, which we've seen. There's some nice studies that compare outcomes with getting antidepressant medication versus psychotherapy, and basically, whether if you wanted to get therapy and you get the therapy, you do better, and vice versa.
Right.
So it fits into the field quite nicely. But I think it also then raises questions about what are the active ingredients of what's getting people better, and it fits into the conversations that are happening in the psychedelic world of, is the strange experience that you have on these drugs, is that part of the treatment? Is it a really annoying side effect? And does what expectations people go into it with matter? It really seems like it does. And for some people will argue that diminishes the effectiveness of the treatment. So some people will say, well, that's just a placebo effect. But I guess a counter argument to that is the placebo effect is that's a real thing. That is really making a change to how people feel. So how do we harness it? How do we understand our brain's abilities to make ourselves feel better? Can we use that understanding to take us towards new, better, less side effect prone treatments?
And I guess, so aside from highlighting the fact that patient preference matters, I suppose the study also highlights there's something about ketamine, at least in this instance, that's unusual. Less ability to note side effects, or less tendency to note side effects, and somehow different, somehow more aligned with patient preference than ECT.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the key, so preference for ketamine meant that people got more
out of ketamine than for ECT.
Yeah, sorry, and reported more side effects with the ECT,
right?
Than the people who if they preferred ketamine and they got ECT, they reported more side effects. So it's sort of an anti-preference for the ECT was happening.
And I wonder if the legacy stigma of ECT plays a role in all of this. Like, did they mention how many people preferred ketamine versus how many people preferred ECT?
Yes. So about 40% of people said that they would prefer to receive ketamine treatment, and about 20% said that they preferred to receive ECT treatment. And so interestingly, there was a nice group in the middle who didn't have a preference.
Okay.
But still, twice as many people were more keen on getting ketamine than ECT. And this was a group of people who were referred, who hadn't got better with 2 previous treatments, and who were being specifically referred to have ECT treatment. And it was just at the point that they kind of got to the clinic that would be offering them ECT treatment,
right,
that they'd be offered the possibility of participating in this trial. I mean, that's probably a massive simplification of what actually happened.
So there could be the legacy effect of ECT's stigma playing a role here, and it perhaps being thought to be a more dangerous or side effect laden intervention. That's interesting. And how reliable do you think these results are? So, like, similar to the Tony Robbins paper, do we need more data, or what would you do differently to investigate this question?
I think the they are reasonably reliable in terms of the numbers of people that they've had coming through. I think the key problem is asking people the question before they come for the treatment. So maybe at the point of screening, maybe at the point at which they just put themselves forward for the study, to try to get away from the fact that reflecting on the answer might increase people's possibility of dropping out or might affect the outcomes in some way. But I think, I don't know, if I ask myself, and if I was going for a treatment, would I be reflecting on which treatment I'd prefer when I'm entering a clinical trial? Probably.
Almost certainly.
Almost certainly. So I think most people have probably thought about the answer to that question beforehand.
And is it also fair to say when entering a trial, most people understand that they just may not get the treatment they want, and that's the point of it, and that's kind of how science works? Is that fair, do you think?
Yeah, they should definitely understand. So that should be a key part of the consent process, that they could get either treatment, that we don't know that one of these treatments is better than the other. That's why the study's happening. And checking with the person that they will still continue with the trial regardless of which treatment they get. Having said that, there's a difference between nodding along and saying, yes, you understand that information, and actually then having the experience of being put into a treatment group that you didn't want to get. We know that people get disappointed when they get the treatment that isn't the new and exciting treatment. So yes, I think it's 100% fair to say that people will know that they could get either one. They should. But they may well still be leaning one way or another in a way that will affect their excitement or disappointment at where they end up.
Anything else you'd want to change about this particular study?
I think for this particular one, that's probably the main thing, because they asked a very simple question and they asked a very...
Any conflicts of interest or questionable sources of funding? Was it funded by Ketamine Co?
Oh, Ketamine, yeah. No, so it was funded by, and I'm going to get this probably slightly wrong, but it was funded by something like an organization that is interested in understanding patient choice or something like that.
Right.
Or, yeah, something like that. So I think the funding itself is probably okay. It had a big list of authors, and I haven't gone through all their conflicts of interest, but generally speaking, I think, and I can't remember which of our guests on the recent episodes talked about this, it's always worth being aware that when clinical academics or researchers get big in their field, they are often involved in drug companies in some way, for example, in delivering lectures that are paid for, in being paid to run their clinical trials. The relationships occur in part because that's just a normal way. A lot of companies will need researchers to help run their clinical trials, and they will want someone who really knows what they're doing, and that generally will be an academic. They'll want someone good to give their talk. Again, that will be that person. But the subtle sources of bias that introduces.
Right. Important to take that into account.
Yeah, always. And I think what that just means is you take it with a pinch of salt and you look for someone doing a similar study and replicating the effects.
Yes, replication is very important in science, to make sure that, okay, just because one study found this effect, was it studied? Was it replicated? And then they have those meta-analyses. You mentioned studies which look at all of the studies, or hopefully, most or a lot of the studies that have been done in that area, to kind of get the aggregate result as well. Again, for this study, key takeaways: does it stimulate your thinking? Does it change your practice?
So I think that we really need to be mindful of understanding our patients' preferences in whatever, I think it's a good reminder, whether we're sending someone for psychotherapy or medication, that understanding what the patient wants, and as I say, this exists in other areas of medicine as well. So if you're sending them for surgery or physiotherapy, understanding what the patient wants and perhaps exploring why it is that they want it and dealing with any misconceptions that they might have. Obviously, this study didn't test this, but... Because
you have the opportunity, if they have expectations which aren't real, or expectations which may distort their expectations which distort their experience, you have the opportunity beforehand as a clinician to clear up any assumptions or misconceptions.
Yeah, for sure. And people talk about, you'll hear some clinicians talking about working in a way that enhances the placebo effect. So to acknowledge that there are things going on when someone gets a treatment that is nothing to do with the treatment itself, but actually, using the opportunity in the conversation to, if they have kind of positive expectations or really negative expectations, making sure that you enhance things that are positive in a balanced way so that they don't have too high expectations and then have crashing disappointment. But that you really give them a sense of hope to go into that treatment with, and that you temper any expectations that they might have about adverse effects. So giving them an idea of, sure, a lot of people will experience this side effect, but actually if we look at the trials, a lot of people in the inactive treatment group, in the placebo group, they, 20-30% of them also got this side effect. So actually there's no, you may well not get the side effect. See how it goes. Yeah,
that's great. That's all we have time for, but I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Dr. Anya, for helping us unravel the mysteries of science.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I hope they are much less mysterious now, and I imagine that's not the case.
I definitely want to continue doing more episodes like this every so often, and we can find papers that are interesting and see, what about them works well or doesn't work well. If any of you guys, the listeners, come across any studies you'd like us to talk about, send them our way. Our emails are in the description. And similarly, if you have any questions about mental health, psychology, psychotherapy, or all those topics, do feel free to send those questions our way. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you back here next time.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Alex.